Hello, potential backers and friends. This is Jason Duff with Earl of Fife Games, here to talk about Heroes and Hardships, most specifically the magic system of Heroes and Hardships. And I want to give you just a rundown of how that worked. All right. Here I have a PL1 sorcerer. Now, sorcerers are built for one type of specific magic, which is traditional magic, and we'll talk about the differences between traditional magic and superpowers now. So there are two different tightly coupled magic systems, if you will, that work almost exactly the same way. If you watched the combat video before this, basically the way it works is traditional magic works more like ranged combat, and powers work more like melee combat. Um, so let's get started. So what happens here is when you build your character or a NPC or an adversary, the first thing they need is they need to be able to cast spells, and so most characters need either the superpowers or magic abilities that allow them to unlock spells and powers. We call what you would normally consider a spell a manifestation. And manifestations are can be built in certain ways by powers and traditional magic. So traditional magic would cast a spell, and superpowers would activate a power. That's kind of the vernacular of the system. What happens is you have an ability that is your manifestation as a power or as a spell, and they do work differently, and they do have different costs. Spells are always they always cost 4 ability points, and powers are variable in cost based on what you do with the manifestation. So each manifestation has certain levels to it. They have different categories such as potency, duration, targets, range, things like that. And some manifestations, based on what that manifestation is, those things can be altered. Let's say range, for instance. If you have the manifestation energy attack, the base is touch for your range. So that's your level 1 manifestation, is just touch. And now you can increase it to make it 2 hexes, 4 hexes, 6 hexes, 8 hexes, that sort of thing. And every increment of 2 is another level for it. So that's how you would change that. Now spells do this on the fly, and powers you buy those in actual character creation or by doing advancement. So that's kind of the overview. Let's do a traditional magic casting here so you see how it works. And that's easy for the sorcerer because that's what he is set up to do, but it shouldn't take much for me to show both. He has the ability Magic User, so he can cast magic spells. That means he can purchase the spells. Now, what spells that he has so far is Energy Attack and Tempest. Okay, those are 2 spells. I'm not going to go into the details of each, but those are the 2 spells he has. These spells they come from the Cosmos School, and Cosmos School uses the skill Harness. So as you know before, the harness is based out of willpower, so he's going to roll 8 dice, 4 plus 4, and keep the willpower 4. So that's what he's going to roll. Okay. It does say target. Do you want a benefit? No. Pullback? No. Additional mods? No. Hardships? No. We're just doing this very simply. Typically, you will target. This is if you're casting at a target that can resist. So you would say yes. This is just the roll 20. Now, spell effects. This is where it gets interesting. Our magic system is very flexible. So taking the example of energy attack, for instance, let's say he wants to hit someone that is not in touch range. That means he has to um, increase the spell levels of his spell to do it, and he can do this on the fly as a traditional magic spell. So let's say they're 2 hexes away. So when all the options that you can raise are baseline, that's a level 1 spell. One spell effect. If you're increasing it, for each one you increase, that's 2, or for each one is another spell effect. So if he's 2 hexes away, he's going to increase it to 2 spell effects. If he's 4, then he's going to have to do 3 spell effects, and so on. This is an example. There's other things that can happen with energy attack, for instance. The potency, how much damage it does, can be increased. You can hit multiple targets at once. That's, for instance, with a spell. And each spell is different. Each manifestation is different. So some manifestations you can't increase potency, some you can, and some are different options based on what it is, right? It's contextual based on what the manifestation is. So, for instance, let's say he's going to do just the 2 spell effects. So he's going to hit someone from 2 hexes or units away, and then we roll. Okay, so he would roll an 8. Okay, I'm going to hover over the roll so you kind of get an idea here. So the first thing is his roll, and he rolled 18, 6, 13, 3. Those are the dice that he rolled, and the 18 and the 13 obviously are explosions on that roll. So that total, and then we subtract 12. Well, what is the 12? Well, in the traditional magic system, you subtract the magic defense of the target. So this is the same as range defense. I'm sorry, in range combat versus base defense, because you always do this in range combat as well. And then you subtract the 13 and the 7. Well, the 13 and the 7 are actually what's called spell dice, and spell dice, they are a variable difficulty that happens based on what level your spell is. You're always going to have that first level, so you're always going to roll one of them, but the more and more you stack, like to make your spell more effective, the more difficult it is. And so 13 plus 7, all that together, the total is 8 here. So if your total is positive after you do this, then you actually hit your target. And so you hit your target, and that would be classified as your base success value, just like an attack would in combat. So that would be 8 in this case. And then you would add any post-roll modifiers, where in this case would be your damage. Since he didn't boost energy attacks damage, which happens to be 5, he would hit the defender for a total of 13 damage. Okay, so they would take 13 other damage in this case. So that's how that works. As a defender, just like in ranged combat, you don't actually, you don't get to actually actively defend, and that's the difference between traditional magic and superpowers, where in superpowers you actually do. So let's look at superpowers. So superpowers encompass what you would think of superpowers, kind of innate powers that come from your being, of what you are. Now this could be because you are a superhero, or you could get those for some reason. Let's say you're an elf and you have an affinity for nature magic or something like that, right? So there's 2 ways to get these types of manifestations, which are called powers. One is you buy the ability Superpowers, which lets you unlock powers, which you buy with experience points or ability points. Or in this case, there are some ancestry traits that allow you to also purchase powers, which would come from your ancestry, like I said, elven affinity to magic, or dwarven affinity to magic as well, things like that. So you can do that as well. I'm not going to talk too much about how ancestry traits work, but um, when you activate the power, they all work the same. So when you buy a power, unlike a spell, when you buy a spell, it just costs 4 ability points or 20 experience points usually. A power is a little different. A power is variable in the cost because unlike a spell, they aren't flexible. A spell, you can change the effects quite rapidly with increasing valid effect levels like your range or your duration or whatever it might be. Powers, you cannot do that on the fly. You have to purchase your maximums on those valid effects. So, for instance, if we use energy attack like we were talking about earlier, I would pay the base of 4 to just get energy attack at 1. And when I say at 1, that means at spell level 1, which all of your valid effects are at the first level. So if all of your effects are at first level, so you get all those automatically, like your range would be touch, for instance, if we're using touch, that example. So if I wanted to increase that range, I would pay for it in character creation or with experience points, and that increases the cost of the power above the flat rate. So if you take, for instance, you want a range of 2, so you're buying a second level power on that range category, and so that costs more at the beginning. And so when you're in play, you can activate that power and hit people from at a maximum of 2 hexes or units away, or inside that range too. But that's the maximum you can do. You cannot change it on the fly. So what's different? Well, when you're actually using magic, the difference is you still roll the same dice. The difference is each manifestation has a active resistance, or they might have an active resistance if it's a targeted spell. If it's something you like, you're healing yourself, it might not have an active resistance. But if somebody is defending, or you have a target of an unwilling person, which is a better way to say it, there's an active resistance. So on energy attack, I believe it's dodge. So instead of using a combination of spell dice and magic defense, you use your active defense, which is dodge. So the defender gets to roll a dodge roll. Now, just like in melee combat, you can default to your magic defense. So if the attack isn't as high as your magic defense, then there's no reason to actually defend. Active defenses against manifestations are free actions, unlike combat actions, which are usually cost some sort of AP cost, like dodge costs 1 AP. But not in magic. Those are just kind of innate things that you do immediately, and that's the difference. So there's no spell dice involved in the power system. So they work almost the exact same, but there's just a bit of a nuance there between the two. And one character can have both, right? It's very possible for a character to say have to be a wizard and have traditional magic, and also have like an ancestry trait that gives them powers, or both superpowers and magic. There might be reasons you would want to do that, so you can combine the two. There's no reason not to. And then the last thing, so those are how those two things work. And the last thing I want to talk about is the concept of surges, which you might consider critical failures. So there's a stat called fate. That's an attribute, okay? And in games that use fate, obviously, if you have a magic setting, you have to use the fate because it is important for magic. Its magic specific uses comes from the focus skill. The focus skill is the only skill under fate. The focus skill does a couple things. Number one, it tells you how many powers or spells you can have total. So it's your focus skill multiplied by 4, so that's the total of the amount you can have. So if I'm a wizard and I have focus of 2, like this guy, I can have up to 8 spells, which is plenty. But you can't have more. So having focus is good for that, but the main thing is to avoid surges. And so, what's a surge? Well, you can surge in superpowers and traditional magic. It's harder to surge with a superpower, and here's why. When you roll your dice, if we look at this harness roll before, he has 2 dice that exploded. Okay, so the 18 and the 13 are the product of are both products of 2 explosions. Okay, he has 2 focus. You can have as many explosions on your roll equal to or less than the focus without possibly surging. So if he would have surged a 3rd time with a focus 2, he would have been said to surge. That's a critical failure. So the funny thing is you can surge if you do too good or if you do too bad. So like I was talking about earlier with traditional magic, you also roll those spell dice, right? The 13 and the 7 on this list. So there's 1 explosion there. So you also look at the total of your spell dice. So if you're cranking up the difficulty and you have 5 spell dice, the more likely is that they're going to explode. So if you also look at the spell dice independently of your skill dice, you have if you have more explosions than your focus, you're also said to surge. Okay, so there's 2 ways you can surge with traditional magic. Now powers, on the other hand, is more difficult to surge because you don't have spell dice, so you can't surge on the difficulty. You can only surge on the skill roll. So that's different. So what happens if you do surge? Well, if you do surge, and let's say you got this 8, and you surge somehow with an 8, which is possible with all the negatives, you need to make a focus skill check that is greater than your total, or the total of your spell dice, to avoid surging. Okay, so for instance, if I rolled the 8 and I surged on that, I would need to beat an 8 on my focus roll or not surge. Okay, if I succeed, nothing happens. If I fail, then I see how much. There's a chart basically that says, okay, you fell by this amount, and if you fell by this amount, this is what you roll. This is where we get into Heroes and Hardships. All the subsystems are very similar. They work very the same way to do the same thing. So now this comes into how wounds work exactly. So you look at a chart, you say how much did I surge or how much was I wounded, and how impactful this is going to be. And so you roll on the surge table. You roll 3d10, and you want to get higher, and then the better you did on your surge roll, the less or the more die you put into the roll. So it's possible you're going to roll 5d10 on a chart with 23 options, and so you're trying to get high, and then if you get 23 or above, nothing happens, right? And then there's, if you roll low or you have a severe surge, right, and you are only rolling 3d10, you're likely to roll lower, and then that's where the really bad things happen on the surge tables. And and when I say really bad things, I mean potentially horrific things, like you can evaporate and just explode, right, if you roll like a 3. So and you can do things to mitigate that. There's optional rules where you don't have to roll. The surge tables don't exist, or you add extra dice to the surge table when you roll on it. that sort of thing, if you want your magic easier to cast and less deadly. But our ideal of magic is for a deadly system out of the box. But it's easily tinkered to the style you want to play, which is pretty much Heroes and Hardships in a nutshell. If you want it less deadly, you can easily get rid of the whole entire surge table, and it's not going to affect you one way or another if you don't want like magic to actually have backfires, severe backfires, or if you want some possibility, but you don't want the absolute worst things. You can just add a dice to it or two dice to it, and then you'll never get the absolute worst, results. So that is how magic works in a nutshell. I know there's a lot of information there, and I've went through it the best I can, just explaining it here. Yeah, just to recap, there are two different magic systems, very closely coupled together. One is for traditional magic, one is for superpowers. They work very similarly, as I said, with some very specific details for a flexible system, which would be the traditional magic, versus an inflexible system, which is the powers, with less dangerous being the powers and more dangerous being traditional magic, and a difficulty where powers are typically less difficult and magic is more difficult. And the last thing would be that the powers can be actively defended by a defender or a target, and traditional magic is not actively defended. It is more kind of how good you are at casting it versus their static magic defense. So that is magic for Heroes and Hardships. I thank you for watching, and I hope you back and follow it along, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.